It's good to see you, and I guess that up there in Skye, life pretty much seems as normal.
Certainly my life does. Self-isolation is part of my modus vivendi, so I'm quite used to that. But I'm fortunate because the space here, I have a nice garden and there's nobody around, so I don't feel the sort of cabin fever that I think a lot of people in towns and cities must feel.
That's right, and I really feel for a lone parent in a high rise with two children. It must be really difficult.
I think very testing indeed. Yes, so I count myself among the most fortunate.
Yeah. So thinking about this whole pandemic and the way that it's arisen, it really resonates with me. What you wrote about the left hemispheric way of attending to reality, in that we think we know what's going to happen, or perhaps we assume a little bit what the future is going to be, and then life is what happens when you're making other plans, and this weird kind of unexpected, for many, world-changing, life-altering occurrence is happening right now, and we don't know. There's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know when it's going to finish, when it's going to end, when people can get back together. Do you see that as something that the left hemisphere would sort of struggle with more than a sort of wider context way of looking at things?
Well, yes, I think that we've got used to feeling that it's all under our control, which is to sort of revert to the hemisphere idea, is certainly the point of the left hemisphere, is to be able to control, predict, and manipulate. I think we were overdue an event that showed us that this is not the case. Often I remember one of the things with patients who have anxiety is the feeling that things are not under their control. And I've spent a lot of my time saying to people, well, that's not so bad, because actually very little is under your control. Almost nothing, starting from, when you were born, who your parents are, how you were brought up, what height you are, all the rest. These are things that are given, and you make the best of that. So I think that's good. I think more importantly, thinking from the hemispheric point of view, is the notion of a context. I mean, a whole lot of things, actually, but the context. In other words, we've narrowed down the context to the very immediate things that we think we understand and control. And it's rather time that was recast. I think it's become harmful. I think we've become rather self-obsessed, rather unimaginative, rather inward-looking in the way in which we work as a society. And sometimes it takes quite a serious jolt to get into another way of thinking. And I think it was going to take something like this, or God forbid, a war, to make us think about our lives and the way in which we relate differently. I mean, at the moment, there is what is often described as a meaning crisis. I'm often asked about the meaning crisis. And somehow I feel that it takes a crisis to restore meaning. I mean, crisis actually is an interesting word. It was introduced in English to describe the turning point of a disease. So the crisis was the moment at which you saw the fulfillment of the disease, and it was either going to get worse or better. This was the crucial point of judgment, which is what the word crisis literally in Greek means. And so I see this as a turning point, which we can either use for better or fail to use. I'm worried that when it's over, we may forget what we've learned, but there's a lot that we can learn in the meantime. It restores the sense.
Yes, I mean, last night there was a big sort of national cheer for the NHS in the UK, and I don't know whether you heard any of that where you are. Probably not, but there were fireworks going off, and there was a sense of collectivity, and that we're all in this together. And I don't want to sort of overplay that, because obviously lots of people are suffering, and it's very, very hard financially and in all other, physically, of course, for lots of people. But there is that, meaning vacuum that we may have had collectively, the sense that we are, working together to overcome something. It hasn't been around for a long, long time, it feels. So it feels that everything became very splintered, and all these different groups, interest groups and so forth. Whereas now, as you talk about the crisis, might be precipitating a new way of relating to reality as a nation, or as a world, even to some extent.
Yes, I think one of the two obviously good things that come out of this situation, however much hardship it may cause, is a renaissance of communitarian spirit. And of course the other is the effects on the environment, which I'm sure we will come back to. But I think it is a very important point that we have become atomistic, and it sometimes takes a common cause like this to bring out the best in people. One of the reasons there's been a meaning crisis actually is that there hasn't been much for people to commit themselves to that is not self-generated and self-focused. And this gives us an opportunity to think about other people. And there are many wonderful stories of people looking after their neighbours. There are also, sadly, stories of people using it as an opportunity to abuse trust and so forth. But I'm afraid, unfortunately, there are always going to be people like that. But the positive thing is the sense of being able to belong and to help one another. Interestingly, in a society, there are two extremes that are more like one another than the terrain in the middle. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that a society which is entirely communitarian in some rather totalitarian way, such as a communist state, is at one extreme. It doesn't actually necessarily produce communitarian spirit at all. And the other is being an aggregation of atomistic entities that are distinct, not just distinct, but actually separate from one another. And that has a similar effect, that i.e. it doesn't give rise to communitarian spirit. What you want is, rather than either of these extremes that have more in common with one another than they have with the middle position is a benign position in which we are ourselves, but we use what is unique and special to ourselves, the gifts we have, to help others. So I think that's what we're beginning to see. And I'm very much hoping that we can learn from that. I think everyone will learn from it, having experienced a bit of it, and carry it on when this crisis, God willing, is over.
That's really interesting. So the two extremes would be an extremely sort of capitalistic, self-referential on an individual level sort of society, perhaps, that's familiar to us, and this sort of totalitarian, forced collectivity kind of system, which paradoxically turns people to become more self-interested and less community-minded, and this element of this balanced way in the middle is really perhaps a kind of ideal that the world needs as a sort of corrective, perhaps.
It's in all relationships whatsoever, this need for togetherness with difference. It's also imaged in how a good couple, a married couple or a couple of partners who are committed to one another live, which is to say that if the relationship is working well, there isn't fusion so that the two become as one and they lose their identity. But it also isn't that they're so separate from one another that they don't have a depth of communion with one another. So what you're always aiming at is preparation and enough togetherness. That's really what I'm getting at. Yeah. But it's not, as it might sound, a rather boring compromise. What I'm trying to emphasize is it gives rise to something that is full of life, which neither of the other extremes actually have. So it's not a kind of flabby compromise. It's actually the thing we should always be aiming for. And one of the things that comes with a crisis of this kind is also a sense of proportion, which is related to it. So we can easily get things out of proportion, particularly when there are very few immediate hardships. We live in the West in a society where most of us, and I count myself among them for most of our lives, have not experienced many of the things that in other societies and in other times and places people have had to endure as part of the whole business of being alive. So we can get things slightly out of proportion because we will always need something to resist and something to fight for and something to complain about. But it can easily become a little bit trivial. And I think that what this crisis gives is the opportunity to see things in a new light. Certainly, I found myself reframing my relationships altogether so that one realized close relationships with family and friends, which fortunately, because of modern technology, we can keep up, become extremely important. And our duties to others and our sense of commitment to others is clearer. I think this is a benign development.
It's certainly noticeable, from people I know and myself, that suddenly you are actually talking to people that you care and love, and there is that sense of paradoxically greater connection because you're actually extending your care and your concern for other people around you, and it was wonderful to see that 500,000 people responded to the call to work for the NHS as volunteers. I think the government were looking for 200,000, and 500,000 people have responded to that. So it's very heartening, I think.
Yes. They've now got more than that and are upping the the stakes to 750,000 if they can get them. This is absolutely fantastic, especially as we know that right at this second, and I hope that the situation will quickly improve, but who knows, so that at the moment there are really not enough protective gear, masks and clothing and so forth, or testing kits. This is very close to my life because my eldest daughter is a nurse in California in one of the areas that is locked down and has a high mortality rate. And in her hospital, there were no masks and there were no testing kits. And she was so shocked by this that she's a member of a group of other health care professionals who train together, mainly in the US. And she emailed them at their hospital and said, is it just my hospital or is this what you're experiencing? And was appalled to find that this is a general situation in America. So, and I don't really want to get party political about this, but I've heard some, I don't know whether they're true, but stories that Trump was offered testing kits and offered protective gear, but turned them down on the basis that they weren't needed. This was a couple of months ago. That may or may not be news. It might be what was fake news, I don't know. But in any case, that is part of the problem. It wouldn't surprise me if that were the case, because as you know, I believe that one of the elements that, one of the many elements that go to make a picture of a society dominated by the left hemisphere's outlook is that the left hemisphere is in denial. I mean, in a very strong way, in denial. It will absolutely deny that there's anything wrong. If half the body is paralyzed, it will claim that it can run a marathon. So it is completely out of touch. So when you're in this state of affairs, you think all is fine. And I think Trump is, an expression of that mentality. And
almost a metaphor for the hemisphere. I said almost a metaphor for the left hemisphere. Trump.
Well, it's one of, say, 20 aspects of modern culture, or even more, that look like it bears the hallmarks of the left hemisphere's take on things. So it's important that gets corrected, not in some horrible panicky way, but as I say, to restore a sense of proportion, that we can't assume that things will always go on in the way that they apparently do now. Immediately one thinks of Taleb's book, The Black Swan, in which, you know, an event which may be very rare is almost certain to crop up sooner or later, probably not in the next few minutes, but when it does, its consequences will be so devastating that you need to have prepared for it. I was very struck by learning that Singapore had a 330-bed hospital which was equipped to deal with just such an outbreak as this, and it was kept ticking over and empty all the time until this crisis came along, and then it was suddenly able to come into action. And of course, they have been one of the most successful communities in dealing with this virus. So we don't seem to make provision for the idea that things will not always be like this. Indeed, our culture encourages us to not to save, not to be sensible about preparation for things that we don't like to think about, but instead to disregard them and, as it were, carry on spending and doing and traveling and thereby polluting and using up the good things that this earth has to offer us. So, of course, that brings us to other very good things that is coming out of this, and we must all be aware of that, which is the both immediate and less immediate impact on the environment. When I say immediate, I mean is that my friends in London say it's quite extraordinary, you know, to hear the street. There isn't aeroplanes flying over, there isn't traffic, there isn't the din of machinery. You can actually hear birds, you can hear people's voices. Things seem more human somehow, even if there is a cost that is paid for that. Of course, in the longer run, we see, even though in this very short spell, that pollution in the atmosphere over China and over Western Europe, as viewed from space, is clearly less. And the water is becoming purer, fish are returning to places where they haven't been seen, perhaps in a lifetime. People tell me that there's for the first time certain insects in the gardens, even in London. So things are responding. Well, that's one of the most extraordinary things, is nature is quite wonderful if given a chance. We have been so relentless in our attack on it that if we could just resist, certainly for the period that we're going to have to, but perhaps take that into account when this crisis is over. I do so hope, because if we don't, my hunch is that something else will inevitably come along. Gaia, as it were, will take steps to restore herself. That might sound a bit mystical, but any complex system cannot take certain amounts of input without changing its nature altogether.
And I think what you said... Sorry.
No, go on.
Well, what you said about hoping that we remember the lessons from this when and if it finishes is really interesting. And I mean, I'm often struck by the fact that when we're not in pain anymore, physical pain, we don't really appreciate not being in pain anymore. And it's almost quite valuable to remember what it was like being in pain. And I mean, whether that's a feature of the left hemisphere, which is which tends to shut down and deny negatives to some degree, and not account for possible bad things happening. But we do need to take the lessons forward, because it's been so dramatic, isn't it? I mean, I'm amazed how quickly nature seems to have reasserted itself. If I go in the park, there's 3 times as many squirrels and birds and bees than there were 2 weeks ago. It's been so fast, it seems to me.
Yeah, well, it's a completely wonderful thing. It may remind us actually how miraculous nature is. And I do think of nature as not just a bunch of stuff, but as something that is connected to us in spirit as well as materially. So I do hope that we do remember these things. But as you say, when one's out of pain, one doesn't remember pain. I have two personal memories of this. One was that many years ago, about 30 years ago, and I got stuck in a lift in a hotel in Madrid, where the lift went up suddenly to beyond the top floor of 15 floors, and got lodged at the top of the shaft. So, and the doors wouldn't open and the thing wouldn't move. So I tried the intercom and ventilator. The intercom failed to work. The ventilator worked for 20 seconds and then went off. And I was in there with my brother. And I thought, it's the weekend. This is Saturday morning. The top floor is only used for conferences. Nobody's going to find us for 48 hours. Anyway, to cut a long story short, somehow we managed to make our presence felt. And little by little, the thing was manually winched down, and somebody managed to unlock the doors. And we came out on the 15th floor. While I'd been in the lift, I'd said to myself, if I ever get stuck, or when I get out of here, one of my things is I will not be using lifts. I will simply use the stairs. And when I came out, they said, I think the lift is all right now. Do you want to go down to the bottom floor? And I thought, well, I could walk down the 15 floors. And I thought, no, I'll use the lift. I thought, how crazy is that? So we do lose track of these things. And the other thing that happened to me is I live in the country where our water supply comes from a stream. And in January, a year ago, for 14 days, we had no water, no hot water, no cold water. You can imagine what that means. Nothing to wash dishes, nothing to wash yourself, nothing to do any of the normal things that one, even to cook or whatever. So it all had to be brought by buckets from the stream and so on. And I really thought how miraculous. When the water came back, I could scarcely believe that you could just go to a tap in the room and turn it on and out would come water just to command like that. And what's more, there's another one that would produce instantly hot water. Yeah. And for a few days I did realise that, but no, now I find I've completely forgotten about it. So it's how do we internalise the memories of the really good things and make sure we don't squander them? One of the things I've noticed is that I'm much more careful about not wasting anything in the house. I mean, I'm always pretty aware of waste, but I really want to make sure that I don't use up any of the things I've got in the house any faster than I need to, because I'm not sure when exactly I'll be able to replace them. And that is a very healthy state of mind. I mean, I'm reminded of the fact that in the 18th century, paper was so scarce that people used to, thank God in those days, of course, they had much clearer and more structured handwriting than we do, but they used to write a letter, first of all down the page, and then turn it through 90 degrees and write across the page, so that they only used one sheet of paper. Now, you'd have to have quite good right hemispheric skills to be able to even read that, I imagine. But nonetheless, it's a lesson in how, we need to husband things. We can't, nowadays we have an infinitely greater number of people using paper than we had, and it's not a resource that we can just carry on relying on. It causes just...
And sort of valuing stuff that we don't usually value, literally valuing it. I mean, I found myself, we were allowed out once a day for exercise to go for a walk or something. I found myself getting excited at the prospects of doing something that usually you would take completely for granted. And it does sort of produce a sort of level of well-being, and not to say that lots of people aren't suffering and that it's very difficult, but that is very important lessons. But what about the financial situation, of course, because it seems to be that economies are pumping billions, or in some cases trillions of dollars, sort of made up money, helicopter money kind of thing, and this is obviously going to have consequences, isn't it? I mean, it's very hard to see how the economies as we know them are going to continue, or the world economy is going to continue as we know it.
Certainly. I mean, of course, I'm the last person to ask about this because I really don't understand economic systems. What I do understand, of course, is that though you can print money, in the end, its value depends on things that are happening, work that is done, things that are produced. And if work isn't being done and things aren't being produced, then everything that we have is being devalued. That seems to me to be, I may be wrong, but I think that seems to be a basic truth.
Yeah.
So quite what will happen in the wake of this, I don't know. But I'm very glad that at least we look after people who are, less fortunate than, for example, I may be, although I'm a retired person and therefore can't afford to have much of the money that I have devalued. But I think that's the last thing on my mind at the moment. I'm sure that, that will work itself out. What won't work itself out unless we're very careful to remember the lessons is how we care for the environment and also how we think of one another and how we value peace, quiet and silence. The tendency will be, and possibly is now, to fill up silence with doing stuff and listening to things that are being said, like no doubt this podcast, but that is good up to a point. But like all things, it's only good up to a point. And taking the opportunity to listen to some silence is a very beautiful thing. Silence is a precious thing. It's a rare commodity. It's not an absence so much as a presence. We're never more absent than when we're constantly bombarded with stimulation. We're much more present when we're there in the moment, attending. That's sort of built into the sort of monastic way in which I live here. And I'm very lucky in that. I chose to live here partly because that's on offer. But I'm hoping that it will strike a lot of people that peace and silence and not having to be doing all the time, not having to be buying, not having to be winning, not having to be striving, but actually being with oneself and thinking peacefully is a very valuable thing to do. So I think that, like many bad things, some good can come of it, as indeed many good things, I'm afraid, that we value can lead to unforeseen bad consequences. So we never really know until we see the whole picture, which in one lifetime we probably won't, what good and what bad comes from things. This reminds me of this that I know you will know, but perhaps some listeners may not, the Chinese story of the man who loses a horse, and his horse disappears one day, and it's most of what he owns and very important to him. So his neighbors say, "What terrible luck." And he says, "Well, bad luck, good luck, who knows?" And then the next day, his horse comes back together with another horse that it's met on the hillside, and now he has two horses. And the neighbors say, "Oh, how lucky you are." And he says, "Well, good luck, bad luck, who knows?" The next day, his son gets on the new horse to break it in, and the horse is a bit wild and throws him off, and he breaks his leg. And the neighbors say to him, "Oh, what a pity, you poor man, what bad luck." And he says, "Well, bad luck, good luck, who knows?" And the next day, recruiters for the Imperial Army come through, recruiting all the able-bodied men to go away to war, and they pass over his son because he's not able to walk. So he says, they say, "Well, how lucky you are." And he says, "Well, good luck, bad luck, who knows?" In other words, we just haven't the knowledge of the consequences of what's happening. And it's much the best to think that anything is 100% bad or 100% good.
Yeah, because we just don't know, and we don't have the wider context. We have a narrow context. At the moment, this doesn't seem good, or this seems bad, and therefore it is. But the wider context is, of course, time, as well as unforeseen consequences from things. But it also seems to be that we've all been plunged into a state of huge uncertainty, which we're not really used to. We like definites. We like to know what next week is going to be like, or next year. And suddenly the world has got to learn to deal with uncertainty, which seems to be a more sort of right hemispheric way of dealing with unknown contexts,
It certainly is. I mean, one way of thinking about the tasks of the two hemispheres in generating communication with the world and our living in the world is that the left hemisphere wants all the time to narrow down to a certainty, whereas the right hemisphere is opening up to a possibility. So the right hemisphere appreciates that, in fact, nothing is ever certain. So certainty is a non-existent state that the best one can say is that one approximates to it to some degree, some of the time in some things. But the reality is our life is always completely uncertain. Becoming used to that and accepting that, becoming used to the fact that there's very little in this world that we can control, and that wisdom is making the best of what comes to us rather than trying to force an outcome, which we really haven't got the ability to do. To think in that way, that we are in uncertainty, we're not all powerful, but we can do the little things that are within our scope. That is a very balanced and wise cast of mind that perhaps we've lost the grasp of. And again, it's not about despairing that we can't do things, nor having this grandiose idea that we'll sort it all out. We don't know what we'll be able to sort out, and that's perfectly all right. Again, one of the problems, I think, is that we tend to think in a disjunct way about problems that the world faces, about communities, about ourselves in a community. We tend to have the atomistic, fragmented view. And you might think, well, in that case, if you believe that it's good for everything to hang together, then surely you must welcome globalism. Well, I think 2 cheers, or perhaps 1.5, for globalism, but certainly 2 cheers for localism as well. There are advantages in thinking globally, and there are advantages in thinking locally. And in terms of the environment, to be helping to back up local producers, to source what we can locally, to validate our local communities and what can be produced there. That is not just going to be a useful thing to help us get through the crisis, but is going to make the difference between whether we survive once this crisis is over or not. We can't go on having a purely globalistic way of thinking. We need to balance that with a proper sense of the value of our future in a locale, in the community where we belong. So once again, it's not one or the other, but it's something very life-giving, in which you are committed to your local community, but not in some tribalistic way which severs you from a larger community, but that you are in harmony with that larger community, but not forsaking the all-important local community, be that family, household, those with whom you worship, or whatever it may be, those in your workplace. But those are the people with whom you need to hang together. So we need to get back to, once again, it comes down to a sort of balance.
Mm. And as you say, thank God we've got the internet and so forth at the moment. But it can be the case that we're more intimate with someone on the other side of the world than we are with our neighbours, and we know more about someone, on another continent because of Skype and so forth, than we do with someone right next door. And that's a very strange state of affairs, really, isn't it? It's a very weird thing.
It is. It's slightly weirder sounding than it might be, in the sense that quite often it enables you actually to keep together with your family and very close friends in a way that you would have done in the past, say up until the end of the Second World War, except in extraordinary cases, your family and friends would have been very local to you geographically. When you realise that until 1945, 90% of the British population had not travelled more than about 5 miles from the place they were born in. So we've seen a completely extraordinary overturning of the idea of local community, because we're all so disparate. And so I see the ability to be close to one's friends and family, if they are separate, as a benign thing. What I don't see as benign is tribalism on the internet. There is no possible group to which you can belong that is monopolistic in its goodness and truth. And when you start identifying with it wholly without being able to be critical of it at the same time that you value its good, its strengths, then you've gone somewhere that we don't want any of us to go. There's a big difference between valuing and belonging to and supporting people that you live with and people whose lives you share, and becoming tribalistic.
Absolutely, and that's really important, isn't it? When you think that we get recommended material on the internet that the algorithms deem that we'll be interested in, so we're only getting feedback which confirms our groupthink or our prejudices, which is perhaps what the left hemisphere kind of does anyway. So, yeah, the tribalism on the internet is a curious thing.
And not only on the internet, but in other places, most prominently universities. So I think I put that up there as one of the crises of our age, along with almost up there with, I mean, probably nothing quite compares with destruction of the environment, because if we really destroy nature and destroy the world, then there's nothing here for us to live on or with. But one of the other crises is that of rigid thinking. And I think there is no excuse for banning certain things from being discussed as long as they're done in a civilized way. Unfortunately, banning people from doing is rarely done itself in a civilized way, but with viciousness, hatred, and vitriol, and that really doesn't help anyone. That can never produce good. It can only produce harm. Anyway, I think this is not going to be the last crisis of this kind we're going to see, particularly in the globalized world that we now live in, where any kind of illness is going to spread very quickly, much quicker than it used to in the past. But we may also experience crises from migrations of population who are finding it hard to live through climate change in the places where they're used to live. I think there may become shortages of resources. And in a way, this is almost certain to happen because the books have got to be balanced. I mean, much as we live in a world where money is phony and we're always, the government actually only has something like 3% of its global wealth actually in tangible goods. So if everybody wanted to cash in their money and stick it under the bed, there would be a massive crisis. In much the same way, we're living on borrowed time and on fantasy goods. There is a fantastic clip on the internet that I do think everybody should have watched. I've certainly sent it to a lot of my friends and certainly to my family, by an American mathematician called Al Bartlett. And I think it was 2002. Quite apart from anything else, it's the most beautiful talk to watch because he's not a young man, but he speaks for over an hour in perfect sentences without a script and making point after point that is very telling. So I take my hat off to him for that, if for nothing else. But his message is of staggering importance. It's that we don't understand exponential change. This was brought home to me by one of the instances he gives, which is worth recounting. If you have bacteria in a jar that double the size of their colony every minute, and at 12 noon the jar is full, when was it half full? Answer, at 11:59. When was it a quarter full? At 11:58. And at 11:57, only 3 minutes out of the hour before it was completely full, it was only 3:45. And people would have said, what's the problem? What are you talking about? We're running out of room. Now, when you apply that to the way in which our exponential use of resources, exponential pollution is carried on, we are going to meet a point at which reality breaks in. He writes in an unforgettable scene. He writes up on one side of a chart all the things that we think of as positive in which we've managed to control nature. So we've helped to banish disease. We've relieved one another of famine. We have largely managed to defuse wars. All these things are absolutely marvelous. But we're growing enormously in population as a result of it, and we simply can't support it. So which of these negative things would you like to step in to restore the balance? It's a question that nobody wants to face. But as he points out, it's not a question of whether you want to face it. It has to be faced. If you don't face it, nature will take this out of our hands. The only way to face it is to limit population growth, grossly limit our demands on the environment, and to get much, much cleverer about limiting pollution. Otherwise, various kinds of horrors, of which coronavirus will seem like a pale shadow, I suspect, will be more or less inevitable.
And it seems perhaps that we do also need to become clearer about what we need as human beings, emotionally as well as physically, that we do need a genuine sense of connection and community to people, that we do need to feel that we do have some influence over events, but we can't control everything, as you were saying. It does seem that we need to get back in touch with what individuals need as much as nations and the global kind of community.
Absolutely. One of the paradoxical things about modern society in the West is that although it's very me centered, actually it's very hard for an individual to express their individuality. They get swallowed up in categories. We're very quick to categorize people by whatever value we want. So they get put in boxes to do with their class or their skin color or their sect or whatever it might be. And in fact, capitalist society, although it has strengths, it has many downsides. I mean, one of them being the inevitable need for everybody to compete in order to stay where they are. But another being that it actually trades on the idea that you can be somehow unique and different. Well, actually, cynically, I'm hoping to make everybody want and desire the same things and behave in predictable ways. So there's a conflict there, whereby people, hang on to some peripheral thing, perhaps something that they've bought or a fashion trend that they're following or the way in which they colour their hair or something which will mark them out. But really this is just a sign. It's just a superficial representation. Whereas the true uniqueness of a person is something that runs right through them, like you're in Brighton, like the word Brighton runs right through Brighton Rock. So your individuality is not a bunch of choices on the surface. It's who you are in yourself, which is entirely unrepeatable. So that all the people you know are not really sort of made up, as you might imagine, out of a colouring kit where you put together, some of colour number 42 and some of colour number 16, and so on, and then you've got a new person. No, each individual person is not made up of bits and categories, but is a seamless new whole, in the way that a great work of art is not imaginable until it existed. You couldn't sort of just make it up out of bits of other works of art that you know. And you can make up bad works of art that way, but great works of art, which are like living beings, much more like living beings than they're like things, as we say. And their individuality is a vibrant element in them. And what I'm really saying is that a society, a community that works well, maximizes the ability for someone to be themselves without that resulting in individualistic striving against the community, but rather contributing as a gift your individuality to the group. After all, who we are, it doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of what nature gave to us in the sense of our genetic heritage and what has been given to us by the society in which we grew up, beginning with our family, particularly the mother, the family, the society. And that is how we come to be the unique person that we are. And then once we are that person, we don't sort of go off thinking, oh, well, I'm now, thank you, I'm now complete as a person. You give back into the society that helped to make you, you helped to make it. Now, unless we hang on to that idea of getting this balance, which is not, again, I emphasize, not a sort of flabby midway compromise, but one in which you are maximally connected and maximally yourself.
Really interesting, and what you say about the parody of individuality, that, you know, just be yourself. It's become an advertising slogan, really. Be unique, be who you are, and all this stuff. Yeah.
It wants you to behave like a flock of people who will like this particular sweatshirt, and so it's not it's cynically appealing to your sense of individuality. But if it thought that really it was only going to sell one to you, it wouldn't be doing it at all, would it?
No. You know, the cynical ploy is that everyone wants to think that they're an individual whilst behaving not as such. You know.
Yeah.
This is fascinating, and this idea of crisis as well, leading to possible opportunity, or perhaps in the man with the horse story, we don't know. We've seen that in history as well, haven't we? That perhaps a balancing of things have been preceded by crisis in some way.
I think it takes a crisis to shift sufficiently our take on the world. Our take on the world has gone badly wrong in the last 50 years, in my view. That's the theme of the Master and His Emissary. I try to explain how and why that is. And in the book that I've just finished writing, called The Matter with Things, I go much further into how that has happened and what we might be able to do about it. But when things are that badly askew, it's no good having a small shift, because it's immediately once again subsumed into the old way of looking at things, adapted, subverted, and then it's no longer a threat to that system that we've got used to. It takes something almost cataclysmic. And thank God, coronavirus is not really cataclysmic. It's dangerous to some people. I don't underestimate the suffering that it can cause, and I myself am in one of the high vulnerability groups, so I know that it does that. But it's not really a cataclysm of the kind that we might be facing if we were overrun by a totalitarian people, or there were a plague which could wipe out a third of the population. So it's as it were a trial run, if you like. It's a sort of rehearsal for worse things that may come. And my God, should we take that into account when this is over and not forget it? Rather, as they say, if you want peace, prepare for war. If you want a stable society, then build trust and build your defenses against the things that are not any longer beyond imagination. So I think it has its value when something happens that really gives things a major kick and wakes people up. When I was growing up, I'm old enough to have heard a lot of people talk about having a good war. And what they meant by that was not that they'd benefited from the war in any way. Of course they hadn't, and sometimes they'd lost family members, and usually this was almost invariably a phrase only used by people who had seen combat. But what they meant was that something happened in their lives that really gave meaning, and that the sort of sense of facing a common danger, behaving in a way that you didn't know you could do, the degree of selflessness that you were capable of, that this drew out from them a sense of richness, of meaning in their lives that in peacetime they could never recapture. Now, if we could only maintain that sense of the value without having to be under a cataclysmic threat, we will have taken away something very important. So I think there are powerful lessons to learn from this that we simply cannot afford to forget when this crisis is over, whenever it is. There are simple things like, I hope we will never go back to air travel to the degree that we have been doing it. I hope that we will always think, does this really warrant a trip, or can this be done over media? And I'm not saying that people should never travel, of course, but again, it's a sense of getting this into some proportion, and at the moment it's way, way out of proportion. One thing that would help enormously, and is well within reach, is to have a technology such as Skype, which is considerably better than Skype. Skype is excellent, and it's similar things like Zoom and Facebook and all those things FaceTime. Here you're talking to a technological dunce, I'm afraid. But anyway, these things are good up to a point, but they're rarely. I do some talks to an auditorium over Skype, but it's not really as good as it could be. And I think that if we put a lot of effort into making that technology so good that you could feel as though you were in the auditorium with the people you were looking at, and the connections were that good, a lot of what we do and requires traveling around the world really wouldn't need to happen at all. No. So, there are all kinds of answers to this that are well within our reach. And we haven't thought about them enough because we've been content to go on really thoughtlessly polluting and destroying. And I am no paragon. I'm asked to travel, and then I do. And then right now I can't. And, bad luck, good luck, who knows? It is in some ways wonderful to have nothing in my diary and to be able to focus quietly on what I need to focus on. There we are.
Well, that's been absolutely fascinating, and thank you very much, Iain McGilchrist. And I hope you stay healthy and happy, and it's really good to talk to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.